The power on the dark side.
Born on Stoojon 57 years before the Battle of Yavin, Obi-Wan Kenobi was taken to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant at a young age. He would train alongside others like Quinlan Vos and Siri Tachi, the latter of which he would have a romantic connection to. Despite passing through the stages, Kenobi wasn't handpicked as a Padawan by a given master. Instead, he was sent to be part of the Jedi Service Corps on the planet Bandamir. It was here that Qui-Gon Jinn was fighting a criminal organization led by his fallen student, Xanatos. Obi-Wan would help Qui-Gon, and the two would become Master and Padawan from then on. They would then go on to defeat Xanatos, partake in the Stark Hyperspace War, and in 32 BBY, assist in the Battle of Naboo. It was here that Kenobi would be the first Jedi to defeat a Sith in over a millennium, Darth Maul, who had killed Qui-Gon mere minutes beforehand. Kenobi would become a Jedi Knight and train the boy whom Qui-Gon believed to be the prophesied chosen one, Anakin Skywalker, honouring his master's final wish. In 22 BBY, the Clone Wars had broken out, and Obi-Wan was one of 10 given the rank of Jedi High General. During the war, he would engage the likes of Savage Opress, Darth Maul, Count Dooku, and even General Grievous. By the Clone Wars' end in 19 BBY, Order 66 was initiated, and many Jedi were killed. Obi-Wan wasn't as unfortunate, however. Upon revisiting the Jedi Temple after it became a smoking ruin, Obi-Wan would discover that his friend, someone whom he'd even considered his own brother, had joined the Sith. No more was Anakin Skywalker. All that remained was Darth Vader. Hiding as a stowaway aboard Padme Amidala's ship, Kenobi would engage the newly christened Darth Vader in a titanic lightsaber duel on the volcanic world of Mustafar, where he would best his former ally. Taking up exile on Anakin's homeworld of Tatooine, Obi-Wan would watch over Anakin's son, Luke Skywalker, under the instruction of Grandmaster Yoda, and would learn how to become one with the Force after death under the guidance of his old master, Qui-Gon. Taking the name Ben, Obi-Wan would be feared by Sand People and farmers alike. After being shown a call for help recorded by Princess Leia Organa of the Rebel Alliance, which was presented to him by Luke Skywalker in 0 BBY, Kenobi and Skywalker conscripted the aid of Han Solo and Chewbacca to travel to Alderaan, and Obi-Wan would begin instructing young Luke in the ways of the Jedi. After being forced onto the Death Star, Kenobi would find himself in a rematch with Darth Vader, where he would meet his end at the hand of his former Padawan. Transcending the physical realm as one with the Force, Obi-Wan would return on a periodical basis to guide Luke further in his training as a Jedi. Quarman Jashalal was born on the planet Kali. Quarman was the leader of a tribe of fellow Kalish warriors as they fought for survival against the Huk colonies invading their homeworld. During this time, Quarman had found a love interest who was killed in the conflict. Deeply saddened by her death, this led to Quarman naming himself Grievous. The Huk, being the cowards they were, appealed to the Senate, claiming that it was the Kalish who had attacked their homeworld. During one fateful mission, Grievous and his crew would be shot down. However, unlike his crew, he survived the crash. He would then awake on Geonosis and be greeted by San Hill, chairman of the Intergalactic Banking Clan, where he received an extensive cybernetic reconstruction, became Supreme Commander of the Droid Army for the Confederacy of Independent Systems, and a disciple of Count Dooku. In the Clone Wars, Grievous would engage some of the Jedi Council's most esteemed masters, like Kit Fisto, Eth Koth, and even Mace Windu. However, there was one Jedi who Grievous engaged multiple times, and was one that possessed a battlefield reputation almost on par with Grievous's own. This Jedi being none other than Obi-Wan Kenobi. In 19 BBY, Grievous would encounter Kenobi for the last time on the sinkhole world of Utapau. It was here that Kenobi would fire blaster bolts at the General's exposed internal organs in his chest, eviscerating Grievous once and for all. Hello everyone, what is up? It is Luke here, and I'm back with a new Versus video. What's interesting about this matchup is that these two have already fought each other in existing Star Wars material. Also, you guys may have noticed that the title for this video states that this is a Clash Edition versus match. Just so you guys know, Clash Edition versus matches will occur when the two combatants I'm examining have an uneven skill set, and in this case, Obi-Wan has the Force and Grievous does not. Therefore, I won't be analysing Obi-Wan's Force abilities in this specific matchup. This is because there is little concrete information covering what old Ben can or cannot do as far as his Force abilities are concerned. Also, since Grievous doesn't have the Force at all, yeah, that wouldn't be the fairest of matchups, would it? But moving on, I want to ask the question of, if these two were to have their final confrontation as elderly warriors, would Obi-Wan still be capable of dismantling the Kaleesh General piece by piece, or would Grievous be able to utterly pound the Jedi Master into submission with a single lightsaber strike? Well, I hope to answer that question in this video. Also, full credit goes to Gensarai1 and Evernova95 for much of the information in this video. The original videos from which the information in this video has come from being Evernova95's Lucy and Dre versus Old Ben Kenobi matchup, and Gensarai1's Anakin Skywalker versus General Grievous matchup. In regards to the combatants themselves, I will examine Obi-Wan up to A New Hope, and for General Grievous I will examine him up to Revenge of the Sith. With that out of the way, let's begin. First, we will examine their physicality. Roughly in his 60s at the time of A New Hope, Ben Kenobi's physical condition would have reduced over the course of his exile. He kept his resilience up to survive the merciless deserts of Tatooine. However, his physical condition bears little to speak of compared to other Jedi in his age group. In the Kenobi novel, it is noted that Obi-Wan's physical degradation was because of the constant exposure to Tatooine's twin suns. This caused his skin to dry out, and for his age to show prematurely. This meant training was more challenging as time went by. Whilst his strength and stamina degraded, his manual dexterity remained refined. Whilst he wasn't able to hold down a 20-minute slugging match as he did in days gone by, he was still able to hold his own in a serious lightsaber duel with the likes of Darth Vader, all the more of an impressive feat considering his age. His reconstruction on Geonosis, General Grievous became an abominable nightmare of sheer might. Unlike Darth Vader, whose physicality was hampered due to the amputation of his remaining organic limbs, fourth-degree burns, and crude limbs due to the construction of his suit being rushed, Grievous wasn't in any instant danger in the aftermath of his accident. Whilst there were given modifications the General wasn't aware of, he did have a lot of jurisdiction in the aesthetics of his new body. Also, there was no need to preserve a great deal of Grievous's organic tissue. In fact, the only organs that did remain in Grievous after he was rebuilt were his heart, lungs, brain, and spinal column. The General's combat performance levels were designed to make him a match to Force-enhanced Jedi. The computers in his brain allowed his reaction time to be increased. He could then move quicker than could be perceived by a human eye. He could wreck metal with his bare hands. He could throw objects weighing hundreds of pounds. He did prefer more unorthodox humanoid movements, though. All his joints had omnidirectional movement capabilities. This allowed him to perform feats that would be outright impossible for a human. Also, his arms divided lengthways, giving him an additional set. His clawed feet were even capable of being used as hands. In the novel Labyrinth of Evil, it states, "For practice, Grievous called 2 more blades from his belt, grasping them in his feet, even as the anti-grav repulsors built into his legs were lifting him from the floor, making him every bit as agile as the Force did the Jedi." Whilst the General can wield 6 weapons simultaneously, he hasn't been depicted doing so in any source. Grievous was simply built like a versatile tank. However, he did have limits. He has suffered many limb amputations. Also, in his final battle with Obi-Wan managed to seize Grievous's chestplate and rip it open, exposing what little remained of the internal organs in the General's chest. In fact, Mace Windu used an application of Force Crush at Grievous's chest. This injury was what resulted in the persistent cough Grievous had in his final days. In fact, Grievous was killed due to what remained of the internal organs in his chest when Obi-Wan pulled Grievous's blaster towards him with the Force and proceeded to shoot Grievous in the chest 5 times in a row. This resulted in the destruction of what remained of Grievous's biological components. To compensate for this, Grievous would focus on protecting his core when in combat, and would use psychological warfare tactics to undermine the Jedi he faced, reducing their effectiveness. Grievous, whilst he wasn't without his limits, was simply the definition of a murder machine. This is rather obvious. Whilst Kenobi isn't to be underestimated considering his age, Grievous is more durable and has blitzkrieging speed on his side, even without the aid of the Force. General Grievous receives a colossal edge in physicality. Now we will examine their abilities as lightsaber duelists. Whilst he wasn't the apex combatant he once was, old Ben Kenobi still remained a considerable duelist. In the Fight Saber article, it is mentioned that old Ben still had his skill in Form 3, Sarisu. Sarisu was developed to combat the steady increase of available blaster technology. It was purely defensive in nature. It focused on the user keeping a tight defense based on minimal movements to give the user high protection and conserve their stamina, enabling the user to fight for extensive periods of time. In addition to retaining his skill in Sarisu, Kenobi likely still had knowledge of how to use a Taru, though his aging and the premature degradation he suffered would have definitely shot his reflexes, preventing Obi-Wan from using a Taru at all. To compensate for this, he used Shi-Cho as a means of attack. He was able to use basic cuts and slashes in order to prohibit his adversaries from securing a solid offensive or defensive position. Despite his agility having been killed by his aging, Obi-Wan was still capable of pulling off deft footwork and positional transitions with blinding speed and a dancer's grace. Furthermore, Obi-Wan's defense was still impressive due to his continued use of Sarisu. He was still able to reflect blaster bolts with ease and hold off Darth Vader. Now yes, he did lose that fight, however he fended off Vader long enough for his allies to escape, which is no easy achievement for anyone, let alone someone with coloured physicality like old Ben. However, despite the lengths he went to compensate for his shortcomings, old Ben rarely dedicated himself to an offense or defense. He would either rely on a push and pull mixture to recognize and exploit a weakness and strike out at the enemy's flank, or be the stone wall who goads his adversaries into being the aggressor and bringing them down with swift and precise blade work, like he did in his final showdown with Maul. Kenobi did also retain some skill against groups, whilst he would have still had some skill in unarmed combat, firearms, and dual blade fencing. They would have likely been scaled back as aging caught up with him. The novel The Life and Legend of Obi-Wan Kenobi notes that Obi-Wan still practiced his saber technique despite having no one to practice with. Death Star even mentions that Obi-Wan's dueling abilities, due to the lack of sparring partners available, was kind of shot anyway in terms of its potency. However, Kenobi's skill with the blade still posed a threat to Vader. In fact, in the novel Death Star, which does take place during the events of Episode 4, it states regarding Vader's thoughts on his old master's skills at the end of their duel on the first Death Star, should his attention falter, Obi-Wan could kill him in the blink of an eye. Whilst he may be hampered, old Ben Kenobi still remained a force to be reckoned with. Put simply, General Grievous was the greatest Jedi killer in the Clone Wars. He was already a force of devastation before becoming one of Dooku's students, having slain so many Hukk that he was considered a demigod by his Kaleesh superiors. However, after becoming Dooku's student, the finesse of Dooku's technique with Makashi and his knowledge of all other forms of lightsaber combat would craft Grievous into a lethal hurricane of destruction. He was able to hold his own and defeat the likes of Shakti and Ki-Adi-Mundi. He was even able to compete with Mace Windu himself. He was trained in all 7 forms of lightsaber combat. Whilst capable of the single blade, his first action in a lightsaber duel was to go straight for dual wielding, usually keeping his additional sabers for quad wielding in reserve, indicating his preference for Jarkai dual blade fencing. Regarding his technique, in fact, Dooku's training was something that Mace recognized. The novel Labyrinth of Evil, again referring to that, stated regarding Mace's observation of Grievous's technique that he could recognize the hand of Dooku in the general's training and technique. This is a massive implication that Grievous used Makashi as one of his primary forms. This, to me, isn't a surprise considering Dooku was the one who trained Grievous. However, Grievous's approach was more along the lines of a Battle Master's 9-man specialist, alternating between all styles in order to confuse his enemies. Simply put, Grievous's technique was that of all 7 forms connected to a random number generator and was able to execute otherwise impossible physical movements. Going back to Mace for a second, he developed his own version of the 7th form, called Vapad. In Labyrinth of Evil, Grievous actually imitated the physical sequences of Vapad. The novel states that the result wasn't Vapad, but it was close enough. This is something I wish to mention regarding a countermeasure method that Grievous frequently used against the Jedi. In the original Clone Wars micro series, there is a comment from Dooku that was made as guidance to improve the General's technique. Dooku instructed to Grievous, "You must have fear, surprise, and intimidation on your side. For if any one element is lacking, it would be best for you to retreat. You must break them before you engage them. Only then will you ensure victory and have your trophy." Essentially, he would stare them right in the face and manage to strike with fear in mere seconds, like in the Battle of Hypori. Also, when fighting Falmon Duma and Roran Krob, he drew on his additional sabers, overwhelming their defenses and cutting them down. Psychological warfare tended to be Grievous's first method, and overwhelming them with multi-directional blade strikes was another key part of his tactics. One flaw I wish to mention, however, regarding Grievous's psychological tactics, is that they were often retorted when he faced Kenobi. Take this scene from the TCW episode, Grievous Intrigue, as an example.
So, Kenobi, is everything going as planned?
That depends on your point of view, General.
Despite that, though, Grievous is still the definition of the term killing machine. This round is slightly more difficult to determine in my opinion. Ben Kenobi, whilst a bit of a fossil, did go to great lengths to compensate for his weaknesses, retained his mastery of Sorisu, and used Sheet Cho to compensate for his flagging capability in Ataru. However, Grievous's skills with the blade are sharp, and he has a wider array of skills to draw from than Kenobi. However, the use of psychological warfare is either ignored or countered by sarcasm from Kenobi. Also, Kenobi's calm demeanor and skill as a duelist is known to have both impressed and frightened the droid general. As such, I declare these two equal in regards to dueling abilities. As mentioned at the beginning, since Grievous can't use the Force, engaging all of Old Ben's Force abilities would be difficult, we are skipping the Force abilities section and going straight to weaponry. Now we will examine their weaponry. Obi-Wan's lightsaber was built by him after his ascension to the rank of Jedi Master. It is a very sleek saber, with a grenade grip section and a thin neck for the emitter section. Obi-Wan's saber used a single blue Ilum crystal as the focusing lens, which decreased cutting power but increased mobility. Also, the strength of the containment field around the blade was toned down to make his saber easier to use and complement his fighting style. Overall, Obi-Wan's lightsaber is sleek and efficient. As we all know, General Grievous has a most extensive lightsaber collection. However, for the sake of being specific, I will examine the sabers Grievous used in the Legends Expanded Universe continuity, those sabers being the former weapons of the Jedi Kukruk, Jamar, Pura, and Nistamol. All the lightsabers were nondescript really, apart from Kukruk's, which featured blade guards on the emitter. 2 sabers had blue blades, the other 2 had green blades. This would have likely reduced cutting power, yet increased mobility. Overall, the sabers Grievous most often used are nothing more than standard. As far as weaponry goes, there's not much to say here. Both combatants' weapons are rather generic. However, due to having more weapons and only because of that, General Grievous gains an ever so marginal edge in weaponry. Now we have reached the verdict. In terms of how this battle would play out, I believe it would play out as a hybrid of the following: Obi-Wan's final duel with General Grievous, Darth Vader's duel with Obi-Wan on the original Death Star, and the very end of the fight between Obi-Wan and Grievous on Utapau, as depicted in the Revenge of the Sith video game. The battle would begin with the two drawing their blades and waiting for the other to make the first move. Grievous would make the first move, whirling his sabers in front of his face. The two would then engage in an exchange of blades until Kenobi severed one of Grievous's hands. Grievous would then back away and take a moment to think, with Kenobi backing away and resuming his defensive posture. In case of a sudden attack coming his way from Grievous, the two would then re-engage, with both combatants fighting much more cautiously. Eventually, though, Grievous's flanks would be evaded by Kenobi's footwork, and he would be met with a deft impalement in his chest from Kenobi's blade, and his body would back away, his limbs would seize up, and his remaining organs would fail. His sabers would deactivate, and he would collapse to the floor, dead, and Obi-Wan would look down on the corpse of his old enemy. Therefore, I declare Old Ben Kenobi, the aged yet still capable warrior of the Jedi Order, the victor. Well, there we have it, my second versus video. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. Just so you know, this is simply my own opinion. Do you believe Grievous could demolish Old Ben, or do you agree Old Ben still has what it takes to best Grievous? Let me know in the comments. Anyway guys, that's going to do it for this video. On a side note though, I do want to apologise for how long this video took to be released. In fact, a lot of it didn't get made until very recently, so I do apologise for having kept you guys waiting for this video so long, so I hope it was worth it in the end. But either way, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, goodbye, you've been warned, and may the Force be with you. Coming soon.
It was foretold that you would be here. Our long-awaited meeting has come at last.
We accept consequence and reject compassion.